you sent us an incredibly dense, fascinating stack of sources this week. And as we dug into your notes, this massive counterintuitive question kind of emerged. Like, what if the biggest, most secure bank vault in human history isn't designed to hold gold, silver, or diamonds? What if it was actually designed to hold people?
Yeah, it completely flips the entire concept of economics right on its head. I mean, the texts you shared force us to look at wealth not as a mathematical certainty. It's not digits in a retirement account or bricks of bullion. It's a shadow of a much older, higher stakes system where truth is the actual currency.
Right, which is exactly why we're doing this deep dive. We're taking the specific research you provided, which honestly acts as a brilliant decoder ring for these ancient metaphors of wealth, and we're putting it under the microscope. We're going to explore how things like pearls, jade, and precious stones are used across biblical parables and even traditional Chinese concepts to represent this totally non-material wealth.
Exactly. Your sources take us through a complete economic life cycle, but purely in the spiritual realm. So we're looking at how this currency of truth is acquired, how it's meant to be invested, the target market for that investment, and ultimately how to spot a worthless counterfeit.
Okay, let's unpack this. Looking through the first section of your research, the foundational metaphor feels almost like a global superpower permanently abandoning the gold standard. I mean, the texts aggressively downgrade actual physical treasures. The physical weight of gold or the clarity of a diamond suddenly just doesn't matter. It is entirely about the spiritual weight they symbolize.
Right. The distinction the text makes is that in the divine perspective, quote-unquote treasures are a metaphor for two deeply intertwined things. First, the truth itself, often referred to as the word. And second, the people who actually internalize and carry that truth. The vessel holding the currency essentially becomes the currency.
Which brings up a specific cultural phrase from the text that I kept circling in your notes. It says, gold has a price, jade is priceless.
Yeah, it's such a profound distinction because you can weigh gold, right? You can check the daily market index for gold. It has a cap. But jade, at least in this traditional context, represents something with an intrinsic, unquantifiable nature. Its value is determined by its uniqueness and the spiritual purity it represents. It's just beyond earthly economics.
So the text is really challenging you, the listener, to identify your jade. What is the priceless, unquantifiable truth that you hold? But I do want to push back on the mechanical aspect of holding this value. Your sources reference 1 Corinthians 6, which talks about a person being bought with a heavy price. When I read heavy price, my modern brain instantly pictures a massive, literal sack of gold weighing down a scale. If we aren't talking about physical metal, how does a person become a heavy bag of currency?
Well, the mechanism of that heaviness isn't about mass. It's about consequence. Being bought with a heavy price means your acquisition required an unfathomable sacrifice, which in turn transfers that immense value directly onto you. But holding that value alters your state of existence. You aren't meant to be a static treasure just sitting in a museum display.
Right.
Because you hold this consequential weight, you are bound by a massive responsibility to utilize it. The text actually calls this doing God's work or engaging in good business.
Okay, but good business implies generating a return. If I am the heavy bag of currency, I have to be spent, or at least invested, to generate some kind of yield.
Exactly. The expectation is absolute active participation in this spiritual economy. Holding the truth without leveraging it is considered a catastrophic failure of the currency's purpose.
Which naturally brings us to the ultimate case study on spiritual return on investment, the parable of the talents from Matthew 25. Now, because you sent us these sources, I know you're already familiar with the basic plot. The master leaves, hands out the currency, two guys double it, and the last guy buries it in the dirt.
Right.
But reading through your notes, my immediate pushback is about the underlying equity of this scenario. Isn't this system rigged right from the starting line? The master gives one guy 5,000 units of capital, and the guy who eventually fails only gets 1,000. He was given 5 times less capital.
It looks that way, yeah. But the text addresses that perceived unfairness by explaining the underlying logic of the distribution. It isn't arbitrary, and it isn't a lottery. The capital is distributed based on the pre-existing ability and capacity of each servant. The master already knows the size of the vessel he's filling.
Oh, so the guy with 1,000 only had a 1,000 unit capacity to begin with.
Precisely. Therefore, the final audit isn't looking at the absolute numbers on the balance sheet. The master doesn't expect the person with a 1,000 unit capacity to generate the same raw profit as the one with 5,000.
That makes sense.
Yeah, the judgment focuses entirely on integrity and effort. It's a test of being faithful in the small things to prove you can handle the architectural weight of larger things.
So why does the guy with 1,000 fail so spectacularly? I mean, he didn't lose the money. He dug a hole, put it in the ground, and handed back the exact principle he was given. In a volatile market, capital preservation isn't usually considered a crime.
Well, in a material market, perhaps, but in the spiritual economy, capital preservation is synonymous with stagnation. The text explicitly labels him lazy and wicked because he produced no, quote, fruit of evangelism.
Let's break down the mechanics of that phrase, fruit of evangelism. How does spiritual truth actually compound?
Think about it this way. When you invest physical money, it accrues interest based on market forces. But when you share spiritual truth, the mechanism of multiplication is the human heart.
Wow.
Yeah, giving the truth away doesn't deplete your personal supply. Instead, it activates the person you shared it with, turning them into a new vessel that can now generate its own profit. The servant in the parable hoarded the truth. He effectively severed the chain of multiplication.
Yeah, but he claims he did it out of fear. He tells the master he was afraid of his harshness, so he just played it safe.
And your sources completely dismantle that excuse. What's fascinating here is how the text equates failing to share the truth with being spiritually hungry and lazy. The text argues that fear is merely a convenient, socially acceptable cover story for spiritual apathy. The master's fury comes from the servant treating a living, dynamic currency as if it were a dead rock to be buried.
Okay, I'm tracking with the mandate to multiply. We have to do business, we have to invest this priceless jade, but that creates a massive logistical problem. If I hold the cure to a terminal illness, obviously I want to distribute it. But in the context of your sources, we are talking about a highly specific, easily misunderstood spiritual truth. Who is the target market? If I'm supposed to trade, how do I avoid bad actors?
That is a crucial point, and the text is hyper-aware of market dynamics. If you hold something truly priceless, you must be ruthlessly discerning about your trading partners.
It reminds me of the startup world. Imagine you've developed a brilliant, foolproof, million-dollar technology. You wouldn't take your proprietary pitch deck and present it to a guy in a dark alley who is actively holding a crowbar and eyeing your watch.
Right, you'd be guaranteeing your own destruction. And the text illustrates this exact dynamic when it unpacks the command from Matthew 7 about not casting pearls before swine.
I mean, pigs and dogs is incredibly harsh terminology for a text that's supposedly about saving people.
It sounds harsh, but the terminology describes a specific mechanical failure in the recipient. Pigs and dogs aren't arbitrary insults here. They define a category of people who literally lack the internal sensory equipment to perceive the value of God's word.
Oh, I see.
To them, a priceless pearl is just a hard, inedible rock. If you force that investment on them, they won't just politely decline. The text warns that they will trample the pearls, become enraged by the intrusion, and turn around to tear you to pieces.
Wow, so the investment becomes actively dangerous to the investor.
Exactly. Furthermore, the sources elaborate on a scenario that is mathematically worse than a failed pitch to a hostile audience. Looking at the notes on 2 Peter chapter 2, there is a catastrophic market failure that goes beyond mere rejection.
Wait, what's worse than getting torn to pieces by the market?
The ultimate failure occurs when someone possesses the sensory equipment to recognize the treasure, accepts it, holds the truth in their hands, and then intentionally drops it in the mud to return to their former degraded state. The text uses the visceral image of a dog returning to its own vomit.
They know they are holding jade, but they toss it out anyway. Why? What is the psychological mechanism that makes someone bankrupt themselves on purpose?
The mechanism is distraction by the immediate. The text notes that this betrayal happens because the holder's attention is hijacked by trivial, eye-catching worldly things. They suffer a catastrophic failure of long-term valuation. They trade a permanent, unquantifiable spiritual reality for something shiny, temporary, and ultimately worthless.
Yeah, they trade the jade for a handful of plastic beads. It's a brutal warning. But let's follow the successful investments for a second. Suppose we identify the right partners, the non-swine. We invest the pearls, the truth compounds, the living currency multiplies. Where is this all going? It doesn't just sit in a massive metaphorical checking account. It seems to be accumulating for a specific purpose.
Right, the metaphors in your sources scale up dramatically at this point. We transition from individual commerce and scattered pearls into massive architectural construction. The gathered material is meant to build something permanent.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Your research brings up the visual of the high priest's breastplate from Exodus and Leviticus. This piece of armor features 12 very specific precious stones, historically representing the 12 tribes of Israel.
Yes.
But the text re-engineers this imagery, connecting those 12 stones directly to the 12 apostles of the New Testament figures like Peter, John, and Philip.
It creates this continuous thread from the ancient priesthood into the foundation of a new reality. The text connects those 12 breastplate stones to the architectural blueprint of the New Jerusalem found in Revelation 21.
The city descending from heaven.
Exactly. The infrastructure of that heavenly city relies on 12 foundations, each made of a different precious stone. The text drives home the point that the perfection of the spiritual realm is designed to be mapped onto the physical world. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Those precious stones are no longer decorative gems. They are load-bearing pillars of a new society.
And the mind-bending part is that these structural stones are actually people.
Yeah. The truth fundamentally alters the molecular structure of the people who hold it, transforming them into living stones capable of supporting the weight of a heavenly city.
Now, I have to highlight my absolute favorite connection in the stack of sources you provided. To explain this transformation, the text brings in the ancient Chinese myth of Nua mending the sky.
Yes.
It compares Jesus taking the apostles to heaven to form these foundational stones to this goddess Nua, using 5 colored or 7 colored stones to repair a broken world.
It is such a masterful synthesis, using distinct cultural traditions to explain a complex spiritual mechanism.
For context for you listening, the myth of Nua describes a cataclysm where the pillars holding up the sky collapse. The world is plunged into disaster. Fires, floods, the sky itself tearing open. Nua steps in to save humanity by gathering these colored stones, melting them down, and using them to patch the gaping holes in the sky.
And the text utilizes this myth to explain how a regular person becomes a load-bearing spiritual stone. You don't just pick up a rock and shove it into a hole in the sky. The stones in the Nua myth have to be melted down.
There's a refining process.
Immense heat and pressure, yeah. The apostles, and by extension anyone holding this truth, must undergo a process of spiritual melting, facing trials, letting go of worldly attachments, being refined by the truth they carry. Only after they are melted and reformed can their diverse, uniquely colored attributes be utilized to patch the brokenness of the world.
It totally redefines the end goal of wealth. You don't gather this spiritual capital to sit comfortably in a vault. You gather it so you can be melted down to stop the sky from falling on other people. You become the infrastructure of salvation.
Wealth transforms from a possession into an act of sacrificial engineering.
But, and there's always a but, anytime you have a booming market, high-value currency, and a massive world-saving construction project, you are going to attract counterfeiters.
Oh, absolutely. The introduction of authentic value guarantees the creation of a shadow economy designed to mimic it.
I always think about the luxury goods market. You can walk down the street in any major city and find tables covered in counterfeit designer packs. From across the street, the fake looks flawless. It has the recognizable pattern, the gold hardware, the brand logo. It mimics the aesthetic of wealth perfectly.
Right, from a distance.
Exactly. It's only when you apply stress to the object, when you examine the stitching, or feel the weight of the material, or actually try to carry something heavy in it, that you realize the structural integrity is non-existent.
The structural integrity is the key. And your sources use the figure of the whore of Babylon from Revelation chapter 17 and 18 to illustrate this exact phenomenon in the spiritual market.
She is essentially the ultimate counterfeit bag.
Exactly. The text is highly specific about her presentation. She is adorned in gold, precious stones, and pearls. She holds a golden cup. She has co-opted all the external markers of the genuine wealth we've been analyzing. She projects immense spiritual success.
So Satan's counterfeit truth doesn't look like a horror movie monster. It looks like a highly successful, heavily decorated religious enterprise.
A heavily decorated, highly active enterprise. The text explicitly notes that these counterfeiters are also doing business. They are running a parallel market, trading and selling their version of the truth, often with massive outward success.
But the counterfeit stitching eventually fails.
The failure is inevitable because the operation lacks intrinsic value. When actual spiritual pressure is applied, when crises hit, when the sky starts falling, the counterfeit truth cannot hold any weight. The seams burst. The text emphasizes that the illusion eventually collapses, people realize the goods are fake, and the entire false economy goes bankrupt and is shut down permanently.
This leads you, the listener, holding the real sources, with a very practical dilemma. If you are standing in the middle of this spiritual marketplace, and you know you are holding the genuine, priceless jade, How do you operate when you are surrounded by stalls selling cheap fakes at top volume? I mean, the counterfeiters are always shouting the loudest, using aggressive marketing to compensate for their cheap stitching.
Right, and the text offers a profound operational strategy for the genuine investor, which is quiet confidence. The sellers of true gold and jewels are instructed not to become defensive or desperate.
You don't get into a screaming match with the guy selling the fake bags.
Exactly. If the market questions your truth, you do not need to over-explain the mechanics of jade, and you certainly don't beg them to buy it. The counterfeiters rely on high-pressure sales tactics because manipulation is all they have. The real treasure speaks for itself through its structural integrity.
You just let the material prove its own worth under pressure.
And the text finalizes this concept with a brilliant metaphor from Deuteronomy, describing God opening the heavenly storehouse to drop rain and dew upon the earth.
Rain and dew. Pure, life-sustaining water.
Yes, the rain and dew are actually another metaphor for the distribution of genuine truth. Consider how rain operates. The sky doesn't scream at the crops, it doesn't negotiate with the soil or run a marketing campaign. It simply opens and pours out life-giving value effortlessly. Genuine truth nourishes the environment naturally. It never has to manipulate the market.
So what does this all mean for the notes sitting in front of you? This deep dive into your research reveals that the ultimate high-stakes economy of the universe isn't tracking your 401k or your property value. The true ledger is tracking the truth you hold. It is tracking how you allow that truth to melt you down and reform you into a living stone, and it is tracking the integrity with which you invest that value into others.
The sources demand a complete audit of your spiritual portfolio.
Which means it's time to look at your own balance sheet. Are you acting like the servant in the parable, hoarding your talents in the dirt because you've convinced yourself that fear is a valid excuse for apathy? Are you taking your most precious, hard-won ideas and pitching them to a market of swine that only wants to tear you apart? Or are you allowing the heat and pressure of life to refine you into a load-bearing stone that can actually hold up the sky for someone else?
The answers to those questions determine whether you are building an eternal city or just running out the clock.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on that terrifying reality of the counterfeit market. We established that the ultimate fake looks identical to the genuine article. The Whore of Babylon wears the exact same metaphorical pearls and gold that adorn the New Jerusalem. The aesthetic is perfectly cloned. So if the ultimate counterfeit looks exactly the same, perhaps the only way to tell the difference between the real truth and the counterfeit isn't by analyzing the jewel or the shiny exterior. Maybe the only way to know is by examining the person holding it. Are they trying to build a heavenly city to mend the brokenness of the world, or are they just aggressively trying to sell you a fake? Keep an eye on your portfolio. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.